The autumn of 1891 brought an unsettling chill to the Ozark Mountains, a cold that seemed to seep not just through clothing, but into the very bones of those who dared venture near the limestone cliffs that towered over the small mining town of Harrow's End. It was here in this forgotten corner of Missouri that 40 men gathered on the morning of October 12th, their faces illuminated by the pale light of dawn as they prepared to descend into a network of caves that local Cherokee elders had warned against for generations. The men were not reckless by nature, but desperation has a way of silencing even the most persistent whispers of caution. A geological survey had suggested the presence of rich silver deposits deep within the cave system, and for men whose families faced another brutal winter with empty cupboards, the promise of wealth outweighed the weight of superstition. The foreman, a thick-shouldered Irishman named Declan Murphy, stood before the cave entrance with a confidence that seemed almost defiant, his voice cutting through the morning mist as he assured his crew that they would return as wealthy men before the week was done. The entrance to the caves yawned before them like the mouth of some ancient beast, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the light of their torches before it could penetrate more than a few feet. The men had brought provisions for 5 days, ropes, pickaxes, and enough lamp oil to keep their path illuminated for what they estimated would be a 3-day expedition into the depths. Among them were fathers and sons, brothers who had worked side by side in coal mines from Pennsylvania to Kentucky, and a handful of immigrants who spoke little English but understood the universal language of survival. As they began their descent, the youngest of the group, a boy of barely 16 named Thomas Whitley, glanced back at the world of light and living things one final time, a gesture that several witnesses would later recall with a shudder. The cave swallowed them whole, and for the first 12 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. They marked their path with chalk, tested the air quality at regular intervals, and made steady progress through passages that grew narrower and more twisted. With each 100 yards they traveled deeper into the mountain's heart. By the second day, the men had reached a depth that none of them had experienced before, a place where the silence was so profound it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against their eardrums and making even whispered conversations feel like violations of some sacred law. It was here that they discovered the first chamber, a vast cathedral of stone, with walls that glistened with moisture and formations that seemed almost deliberately shaped as though carved by hands, rather than formed by centuries of water and mineral deposits. The silver they sought was indeed present, veins of it running through the rock like frozen lightning, and for a brief moment the men allowed themselves to celebrate, their voices echoing strangely in the enormous space. But celebration turned to unease when one of the miners, a German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, pointed to markings on the chamber wall that were clearly not natural formations. They were symbols, dozens of them, carved deep into the limestone in patterns that suggested language or warning, though no one among the 40 could decipher their meaning. Declan Murphy ordered the men to ignore the carvings and focus on extracting samples of the silver ore, but several of the miners later reported that from that moment forward, the atmosphere in the caves changed in a way that defied rational explanation. The third day brought the first disappearance. A miner named Samuel Hodge, a quiet man from Tennessee known for his reliability and steady nerves, volunteered to scout a side passage that appeared to lead to another chamber. He took a lamp and a length of rope, promising to return within the hour, but when 60 minutes passed with no sign of him, a search party was organized. They found his lamp still burning, placed carefully on the ground at the entrance to a tunnel so narrow a man would have to crawl through it on his belly, but there was no sign of Samuel himself. The rope he had carried was gone, and more disturbing still, the chalk marks he should have made to indicate his path were absent. It was as though he had simply chosen to vanish, leaving behind only the light to mark where he had last stood. Declan Murphy made the decision to seal off that passage and ordered the men to work in pairs from that point forward. But the damage to morale had already been done. Whispers began to circulate through the group, theories that ranged from the possibility of hidden shafts and sudden drops to darker suggestions that something in the caves was watching them, waiting for moments of isolation to strike. On the 4th day, the caves began to change. Passages that the men had carefully marked and mapped seemed to lead to different locations than they had the day before, and tunnels that should have taken them back toward the surface instead spiraled deeper into the earth. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, carrying with it a smell that several men described as ancient rot mixed with something metallic and sharp. It was then that the sounds began, noises that echoed through the stone corridors with no discernible source, sounds that resembled voices speaking in languages that predated any tongue the miners knew, mixed with rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. 3 more men vanished that day, all of them experienced miners who would never have made the amateur mistake of wandering off alone. Yet they disappeared as completely as if the mountain had opened up and swallowed them whole. By nightfall of the 4th day, panic had fully set in among the remaining 36 men, and Declan Murphy, his earlier confidence shattered, made the decision to abandon the silver and focus entirely on finding their way back to the surface before they all shared the fate of their missing companions. The retreat began in chaos. Men who had maintained discipline and order during the descent now scrambled over one another in their desperation to escape, their lamps casting wild shadows that danced across the cave walls like mocking specters. Declan Murphy attempted to maintain some semblance of leadership, shouting orders that were largely ignored as the group fragmented into smaller clusters, each following what they believed to be the correct path back to the entrance. The chalk marks they had so carefully placed during their descent were still visible, but they no longer seemed to form a coherent trail. Some marks appeared to have been altered. Arrows that had pointed toward the surface now redirected deeper into the cave system, and in several locations. The miners found their own markings duplicated on opposite walls, as though the passages themselves had been rearranged while they worked. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. These were men who had spent their lives underground, who trusted their ability to navigate the dark spaces of the earth with the same confidence a sailor trusts the stars, and now that fundamental certainty had been stripped away. As the group separated, each taking different routes in hopes of finding the exit, the disappearances accelerated. Men would be walking in the middle of a line of their companions one moment and simply absent the next, with those in front and behind unable to explain how someone could vanish from between them without a sound or struggle. One group of 7 miners, led by a Welsh coal veteran named Griffith Davies, reported hearing footsteps behind them that perfectly matched their own pace, stopping when they stopped, resuming when they moved forward. But when they turned to investigate, they found only empty tunnels stretching back into darkness. Another group discovered a chamber filled with the personal belongings of their missing companions, items carefully arranged in a circle around a natural stone formation that resembled an altar, though none of the missing men were anywhere to be found. The lamp oil was running dangerously low, and the men were forced to make the agonizing decision to consolidate their remaining lights, which meant some would have to navigate the darkness with only the dim glow from their companions' lamps to guide them. By what they estimated to be the 5th day, though time had become nearly impossible to track in the unchanging darkness, only 19 men remained together in a group that had finally reunited after hours of desperate searching through the tunnels. They had found no trace of the 21 who had vanished, and worse still, they had found no sign of the surface. Every passage they tried seemed to lead them in circles or deposit them in chambers they swore they had never seen before, despite their meticulous mapping efforts. It was in one of these unknown chambers that they made a discovery that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The walls were covered not with the random symbols they had seen before, but with images, pictographs, that told a story in visual language that transcended the barrier of unknown words. The images depicted figures descending into the earth, just as the miners had done. But what followed in the sequence of pictures was a transformation, the human figures gradually changing into something else, something that walked upright, but no longer resembled men. The group's collective horror at these images was interrupted by a sound that froze every man in place. It was singing, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Voices that harmonized in ways that human vocal cords should not be able to produce. The words, if they were words, belonged to no language any of the miners recognized, but the emotion behind the singing was unmistakable. It was a sound of welcome, of invitation, of hunger. Thomas Whitley, the youngest of the group, began to walk toward the source of the sound as if in a trance, his eyes unfocused and his lips moving silently. It took 3 men to physically restrain him and drag him back from the passage entrance where the singing seemed to originate, and even then he fought against them with a strength that seemed impossible for his slight frame. When he finally stopped struggling, he had no memory of the incident, but his nose was bleeding, and he complained of a splitting headache that would not subside. The decision was made to barricade themselves in the chamber and wait for rescue, a plan born more of desperation than logic, as no one on the surface would know where to begin searching for them in the vast network of caves. They used rocks and debris to block the main entrance to their refuge, leaving only a small gap through which they could observe the tunnel beyond. For hours nothing happened, and some of the men began to hope that perhaps they had finally found a defensible position, a place where whatever hunted them in the darkness could not reach. That hope died when they saw the lights approaching from the tunnel, dozens of lamps moving toward their barricade in absolute silence. The lights moved with purpose and coordination, and as they drew closer, the men could see that the lamps were being carried by figures that wore the clothes and bore the faces of their missing companions, but something in the way these figures moved, in the blank expression of their eyes and the mechanical precision of their steps, made it clear that whatever approached them was no longer entirely human. The barricade held for less than an hour. The figures outside did not attempt to break through with force, but instead began to dismantle the barrier with methodical patience, moving stones one at a time with movements that seemed synchronized, as though controlled by a single consciousness. The 19 men inside the chamber pressed themselves against the far wall, their remaining lamps held high, casting light on the entrance where their former companions worked in eerie silence. Declan Murphy, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that no longer held any authority, attempted to communicate with the figures, calling out the names of men he had worked beside for years, pleading with them to stop, to explain what had happened to them in the depths of the caves. The figures did not respond, did not even acknowledge that they had heard him, their blank eyes fixed on their task, with an intensity that suggested nothing existed for them beyond the imperative to remove every stone that separated them from the men inside. When the barricade finally fell, the figures entered the chamber in a single line, moving with that same disturbing coordination, and the men inside scattered in panic, fleeing through the only other exit available, a narrow crack in the chamber wall that led to a passage so tight they had to squeeze through sideways. In the chaos of the escape, the group fragmented once more, men pushing and clawing at one another in their desperation to put distance between themselves and the things that wore the faces of their friends. Thomas Whitley found himself in a group of 5, including Declan Murphy, and 3 others whose names he would later struggle to remember through the fog of trauma that would cloud his memories of these events. They ran blindly through passages that seemed to shift and change around them, the stone walls appearing to pulse with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of their hearts. Behind them, they could hear the sound of footsteps, always maintaining the same distance, never falling behind but never quite catching up, as though whatever pursued them was content to herd them towards some predetermined destination. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber so vast their lamplight could not reach the ceiling or the far walls, a space that felt less like a natural cave formation and more like a deliberately constructed hall. The floor was smooth, almost polished, and in the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied immediate comprehension. It was a spiral of stone that seemed to descend into the floor, a staircase, or perhaps a well, carved with the same symbols they had seen throughout the caves, but arranged here in patterns that suggested ritual significance. The 5 men approached the structure with a mixture of terror and fascination, drawn by a compulsion they could not name or resist. As they drew closer, they could see that the spiral was not empty, but filled with a darkness that was somehow deeper and more absolute than the ordinary absence of light, a blackness that seemed to absorb their lamp glow without reflecting any of it back. It was Declan Murphy who first looked into that darkness and saw what waited below. His scream was not one of fear, but of recognition, a sound that conveyed the horror of understanding something that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. He staggered backward, his hands clutching at his head, and began to speak in a torrent of words that made no sense. Fragments of sentences in English, mixed with sounds that belonged to no human language. The other men tried to pull him away from the spiral, but he fought them with manic strength, insisting that he had to go down, that they all had to go down, that it was the only way to understand, the only way to become what they were always meant to be. In the struggle, one of the men, a miner whose name Thomas would never learn, was pushed too close to the edge of the spiral and lost his balance, tumbling into that absolute darkness without a sound, as though the blackness had swallowed even his scream. The remaining 4 men fled the chamber, dragging Declan Murphy with them as he continued to rave about what he had seen in the depths of the spiral. Descriptions of spaces that existed outside of normal geometry, of entities that had dwelt beneath the Ozark mountains since before humanity had crawled from the oceans, of a purpose and intelligence so vast and alien that to perceive it even for a moment was to feel one's own consciousness fragmenting under the weight of that awareness. They found themselves in a series of smaller tunnels, passages that seemed to slope upward, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they allowed themselves to hope that they might be approaching the surface. The air grew fresher, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, rather than the ancient rot that had permeated the deeper chambers. Thomas Whitley, his youth giving him reserves of strength the older men had exhausted, took the lead, following the upward slope with single-minded determination, refusing to consider the possibility that this too might be another trick of the caves, another false promise of escape. They emerged into daylight on the morning of October 19th, 7 days after they had entered the caves, though it felt to the survivors as though they had been underground for months or even years. Only 2 men crawled out of that cave entrance, Thomas Whitley and Declan Murphy, their clothes torn and filthy, their skin pale as corpses, their eyes carrying a haunted quality that would never fully fade. The other 2 men who had been with them in those final hours had vanished somewhere in the last stretch of tunnels, disappearing as silently and completely as all the others, leaving no trace of their passage or their fate. A crowd had gathered near the cave entrance, families who had maintained a vigil since the miners failed to return on schedule, and their cries of relief at seeing survivors quickly turned to confusion and horror as they realized that only 2 of the 40 men who had entered were coming back out. Thomas collapsed immediately upon reaching the surface, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion and terror that adrenaline had kept at bay during the escape. Declan Murphy remained standing, but his eyes were unfocused, staring at something no one else could see, and when people approached him with questions, he responded only with that same stream of fragmented sentences, mixing coherent English with those alien sounds that seemed to cause physical discomfort in those who heard them. The local doctor, a man named Harrison Webb, who had served as a field surgeon during the war and considered himself unshakable, examined both men and declared them to be in a state of severe psychological shock, though he privately confessed to the town marshal that he had never seen trauma manifest in quite this way. Both men were taken to the doctor's home, where they were sedated and placed under observation, but even in sleep, they were not at peace, their bodies twitching and jerking as though trying to escape from nightmares that pursued them even into unconsciousness. When Thomas Whitley finally regained enough coherence to speak, 3 days after his emergence from the caves, his account of what had happened underground was met with a mixture of belief and skepticism. He spoke of the disappearances, of the changing passages and the symbols on the walls, of the figures that wore the faces of their missing companions, and of the spiral chamber, where Declan Murphy had looked into an abyss that had looked back into him with an intelligence that was vast and hungry and utterly inhuman. The families of the missing men demanded that a rescue expedition be organized immediately, but Thomas became hysterical at the suggestion, insisting that no one should ever enter those caves again, that the 38 men who had not returned were beyond any help that the living could provide. His testimony was recorded by the town marshal, a detailed account that filled dozens of pages with descriptions of events that seemed to belong more to fever dreams than to any rational reality. Declan Murphy never recovered his sanity. He remained in Dr. Webb's care for 2 weeks, during which time his condition only deteriorated. He would spend hours drawing symbols on any surface available to him, recreating the markings they had seen in the caves with obsessive precision, and when prevented from drawing, he would carve the symbols into his own skin with his fingernails. muttering constantly in that mixture of English and alien phonemes. On the night of November 3rd, he managed to escape from his room despite the locked door and the attendant posted outside. He was found the next morning at the entrance to the caves, his body broken at the base of the cliff, having apparently thrown himself from the top in an attempt to return to the depths. In his hand was clutched a piece of paper on which he had written a single sentence in English that was clear and coherent. "They are still down there, and they are waiting for us to come back." The caves were officially sealed by order of the territorial government, the entrance dynamited and collapsed, though local residents reported for years afterward that on certain nights, particularly in autumn when the air grew cold and the mist settled heavy in the valleys, sounds could be heard emanating from the mountain, sounds that resembled singing in languages that no living person spoke, mixed with the rhythmic tapping of tools against stone, as though somewhere deep beneath the earth work continued in the darkness. Thomas Whitley left Harrow's End within a month of his escape from the caves, moving east to St. Louis, where he attempted to build a new life far from the Ozark Mountains. He never spoke publicly about his experience again, though he was known to suffer from severe insomnia and would often be found walking the streets at night, unable to bear the darkness of his own bedroom. In 1903, 12 years after the incident, he was committed to a psychiatric institution after being found attempting to dig through the floor of his apartment with his bare hands, insisting that he could hear them calling to him from below, promising that if he could just go deep enough he would finally understand what they had been trying to show him all along. The official investigation into the Harrow's End mining disaster, as it came to be known in territorial records, was brief and unsatisfying. A team of federal investigators arrived in late November of 1891, tasked with determining what had caused the deaths of 38 men and the complete psychological collapse of the only 2 survivors. They interviewed Thomas Whitley before his departure from the region, though his testimony was deemed unreliable due to his obvious mental distress and the fantastical nature of his claims. They examined the sealed cave entrance, noting in their report that the limestone formations in the area were unusually complex and prone to creating acoustic anomalies that could explain some of the sounds the survivors had reported. The official conclusion, published in early 1892, attributed the disaster to a combination of factors, including poor air quality leading to hallucinations, the psychological stress of being lost in an unmapped cave system, and possible exposure to naturally occurring gases that could have caused both physical and mental impairment. This explanation satisfied no one who had actually witnessed the condition of the survivors or who had heard Thomas Whitley's detailed and consistent account of the events underground. The families of the missing men rejected the official findings, pointing out that experienced miners would have detected dangerous gases and that the specific details of Thomas's testimony, particularly his descriptions of the symbols and the spiral chamber, were too elaborate and coherent to be dismissed as mere hallucination. A group of family members pooled their resources and hired a private investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Marcus Holloway, to conduct an independent inquiry into the disappearances. Holloway spent 3 months in the Ozark region, interviewing witnesses, examining historical records, and attempting to gain access to the sealed caves, though local authorities refused to grant him permission to excavate the collapsed entrance. What Holloway discovered in the course of his investigation added layers of disturbing context to the tragedy. He found records indicating that the cave system beneath the Ozark Mountains had been the site of unexplained disappearances dating back decades, though none on the scale of the 1891 incident. In 1867, a group of Confederate deserters had reportedly taken refuge in the caves and were never seen again. In 1873, 2 children from a nearby settlement had vanished while playing near one of the cave entrances, their bodies never recovered. In 1881, a geological survey team of 4 men had entered the caves to map the system, and only 3 had returned, the survivor refusing to discuss what had happened to his missing colleague. Most intriguing of all, Holloway uncovered references in old territorial archives to warnings issued by Cherokee leaders in the early 1800s, before European settlement of the region, describing the caves as a sacred place that was forbidden to enter, a threshold to an underworld inhabited by beings the Cherokee called the Nunahi, spirits or entities that existed in spaces between the world of the living and some other realm that human language struggled to define. Holloway's final report, submitted to the families who had hired him in March of 1892, concluded that while he could not explain the specific mechanisms of what had occurred in the caves, the pattern of disappearances and the consistency of survivor testimony across different incidents suggested that something genuinely anomalous existed within the cave system, something that the official investigation had either failed to recognize or had chosen to ignore. He recommended that the caves remain sealed and that the area be designated as prohibited territory, a recommendation that was never officially adopted but was largely followed in practice by local residents who needed no government order to convince them to stay away from the mountain. The families of the missing men held a memorial service in April of 1892, erecting a monument in the Harrow's End Cemetery that listed the names of all 38 men who had entered the caves and never returned, though their bodies were never recovered and no graves could be dug. The town of Harrow's End itself did not long survive the disaster. The silver deposits that had lured the miners to their doom were never exploited, and without the promise of mineral wealth, the settlement had no economic foundation to sustain it. By 1895, most of the residents had moved away, seeking opportunities in larger towns where the shadow of the caves did not loom over every conversation and every nightmare. The few families who remained reported ongoing disturbances, sounds from the mountain that grew more frequent and more disturbing as the years passed, and by 1900, even these holdouts had abandoned their homes. The town was officially dissolved in 1902, its buildings left to decay and collapse, reclaimed by the forest that had been cleared to make room for human habitation. Today, almost nothing remains of Harrow's End, except for a few foundation stones, and the cemetery where the memorial to the lost miners still stands, its inscriptions weathered but still legible to those who venture into the remote valley where the town once stood. The fate of Thomas Whitley in the years following his escape from the caves provides a tragic coda to the story of the Harrow's End disaster. After his commitment to the psychiatric institution in St. Louis in 1903, he became the subject of study by several prominent alienists, as psychiatrists were known in that era, who were fascinated by the specific and persistent nature of his delusions. Unlike many patients whose symptoms varied or evolved over time, Thomas remained fixated on a single set of beliefs related to his experience in the caves, beliefs that he articulated with a clarity and consistency that his doctors found both remarkable and deeply unsettling. He spoke of the entities beneath the earth as though they were not supernatural beings, but rather a form of life that had evolved in isolation from the surface world, developing along pathways so divergent from terrestrial biology that human perception could barely register their existence except as a kind of cognitive dissonance that manifested as terror. One of the doctors who treated Thomas, a physician named Albert Marsh, who had studied the emerging field of psychology in Vienna, became convinced that his patient was not delusional in the traditional sense, but was rather suffering from what Marsh termed traumatic enlightenment, a condition in which exposure to experiences outside the normal range of human perception had fundamentally altered the patient's consciousness in ways that made it impossible for him to function in ordinary society. Marsh documented Thomas's case extensively, filling journals with transcriptions of their conversations, in which Thomas attempted to describe what he had seen in the spiral chamber, using metaphors and analogies that Marsh found both poetic and disturbing. Thomas spoke of spaces that existed in more than 3 dimensions, of consciousness that was distributed across vast networks rather than concentrated in individual organisms, of time that flowed in directions that had no correspondence to the linear progression humans experienced. In 1907, Thomas Whitley died in the institution at the age of 32, his body simply giving out after years of insomnia and the physical toll of constant psychological stress. Dr. Marsh performed the autopsy himself and noted several anomalies in his report, including unusual calcification in certain areas of the brain and a pattern of neural degradation that he had never encountered in other patients. Most disturbing was Marsh's observation that Thomas's brain tissue, when examined under microscope, showed what appeared to be organized structures that resembled the symbols Thomas had described seeing in the caves, patterns that Marsh initially dismissed as artifacts of the preservation process, but which he later came to believe might represent some form of physical alteration induced by whatever Thomas had been exposed to in the depths. Marsh's report was never published in mainstream medical journals, deemed too speculative and too disturbing for academic discourse, but it circulated privately among researchers interested in the intersection of psychology and the paranormal. The sealed caves remained undisturbed for decades, becoming the subject of local legend and occasional interest from folklorists and paranormal investigators, though none were granted official permission to excavate the entrance or explore the system. In 1947, during the early years of the Cold War, there was brief military interest in the caves as a potential site for secure underground facilities, and a team of Army engineers conducted a survey of the area. The details of what they found, if anything, remain classified, but the project was abruptly cancelled and the area was quietly purchased by the federal government and designated as restricted land, officially for environmental conservation purposes, but with security measures that seemed excessive for a simple nature preserve. Locals reported seeing military personnel in the area periodically over the following decades, always in small groups, always conducting activities that were never explained to the civilian population. In 1973, a group of university students, inspired by the growing popularity of spelunking as a recreational activity and intrigued by the legends surrounding the Harrow's End caves, attempted to locate and enter the sealed system through alternative entrances they believed existed based on geological surveys. 3 of the 5 students returned after 2 days, reporting that they had found a way into the cave system but had fled after encountering what they described as architectural features that could not be natural formations and sounds that seemed to come from deeper within the mountain. The 2 students who did not return were the subject of a search and rescue operation that lasted for a week, but no trace of them was ever found. The incident led to increased security around the area and the posting of warning signs that remain in place to this day, though the official reason given for restricting access is the presence of endangered bat species rather than any acknowledgement of the historical events or the ongoing mysteries associated with the location. The question of what actually happened in the Ozark caves in October of 1891 has never been satisfactorily answered, and perhaps it never can be, at least not in terms that fit comfortably within our conventional understanding of reality. The skeptical explanation, favored by mainstream historians and scientists, holds that the miners encountered a combination of natural hazards, including toxic gases, disorientation caused by the complex cave system, and the psychological breakdown that can occur when groups of people are subjected to extreme stress in confined darkness. This explanation accounts for some of the reported phenomena, but struggles to address the specific consistencies in survivor testimony, the pattern of disappearances that preceded and followed the main incident, and the physical evidence documented by investigators like Marcus Holloway and Dr. Albert Marsh. An alternative interpretation, one that exists primarily in the realm of speculative anthropology and fringe archaeology, suggests that the caves may have been the site of pre-Columbian activities by indigenous peoples, possibly including ritual practices that left behind the symbols and structures the miners encountered. This theory proposes that the psychological effects experienced by the miners could have been induced by exposure to psychoactive compounds used in ancient ceremonies, substances that might have been present in the cave environment either naturally or as residue from historical use. Proponents of this view point to the Cherokee warnings about the caves and to similar legends found among other indigenous groups in the region, suggesting a cultural memory of the caves as a dangerous or sacred space that should be avoided. However, this explanation also has significant weaknesses, particularly in accounting for the disappearances themselves and the specific nature of the phenomena reported by survivors. A third perspective, one that has gained some traction among researchers interested in anomalous phenomena, proposes that the Ozark caves may represent a location where the normal laws of physics and perception break down in ways that science does not yet understand. This view suggests that certain geological formations, possibly in combination with electromagnetic anomalies or other environmental factors, can create conditions that affect human consciousness and even physical reality in profound ways. Advocates of this theory point to other locations around the world where similar phenomena have been reported, places where people experience missing time, spatial distortions, and encounters with entities or presences that defy conventional explanation. While this perspective is dismissed by mainstream science as pseudoscientific speculation, it has the advantage of taking seriously the testimony of witnesses without requiring belief in supernatural entities or ancient curses. What cannot be disputed is the lasting impact of the Harrow's End disaster on those who survived it, on the families of those who did not, and on the broader community that witnessed the aftermath. The incident became a cautionary tale that spread throughout mining communities across the country, a story told to remind workers of the dangers that lurked in the earth and the importance of respecting the warnings of those who had come before. It also became part of the folklore of the Ozark region, one of many stories of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena that have given the area a reputation for mystery and danger that persists to this day. The memorial stone in the abandoned cemetery at Harrow's End still receives occasional visitors, people drawn by curiosity or by a desire to pay respects to men who died in circumstances that remain, more than a century later, fundamentally mysterious. The broader implications of the Harrow's End incident extend beyond the specific tragedy of 40 men entering caves and only 2 returning. The story raises questions about the limits of human knowledge and the possibility that there are aspects of our world, particularly in the deep places beneath the surface, that remain fundamentally unknown and perhaps unknowable. It challenges our assumption that the Earth has been fully explored and mapped, that there are no more mysteries left to discover in an age of satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar. Most unsettling of all, it suggests that there may be forms of existence or consciousness that share our planet, but operate according to principles so alien to our own that meaningful communication or understanding is impossible, and that contact with such otherness can shatter the human mind as surely as physical trauma can break the body. The psychological impact of the Harrow's End disaster on the survivors and the community provides insight into how human beings process trauma that falls outside the boundaries of normal experience. Thomas Whitley and Declan Murphy both exhibited symptoms that would today be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But their cases were complicated by the specific nature of their trauma, which involved not just fear and loss, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of reality itself. Modern psychology recognizes that trauma is most difficult to process when it involves experiences that cannot be integrated into existing mental frameworks, when the mind encounters something so far outside its expectations that it has no category in which to place the experience. For Thomas and Declan, the caves had revealed something that their minds were not equipped to comprehend, and the resulting cognitive dissonance manifested as the symptoms their doctors observed. The families of the missing men faced a different but equally profound challenge: the trauma of ambiguous loss, a term coined by psychologists to describe the unique pain of losing someone without closure, without a body to bury or clear confirmation of death. The 38 men who did not return from the caves existed in a liminal state in the minds of their loved ones, neither definitively dead nor possibly alive, and this ambiguity made the grieving process extraordinarily difficult. Some families held out hope for years that their missing relatives might somehow return, that perhaps they had found another exit from the caves and were making their way home through the wilderness. Others convinced themselves that the men had died quickly and painlessly, preferring that narrative to the alternative suggested by Thomas Whitley's testimony, that their loved ones might have experienced something far worse than simple death in the darkness beneath the earth. The community of Harrow's End as a whole experienced what might be termed collective trauma, a shared psychological wound that affected the social fabric of the town and ultimately contributed to its dissolution. The disaster destroyed the economic foundation of the settlement, but more than that, it destroyed the sense of safety and normalcy that communities require to function. People reported difficulty sleeping, constant anxiety, and a pervasive sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the land itself, that the earth beneath their feet could not be trusted. Children who had been too young to remember the incident directly still absorbed the trauma through the stories they heard and the fear they observed in their parents, creating a second generation of psychological casualties. The decision of most families to abandon Harrow's End can be understood not just as an economic necessity, but as a psychological imperative, a recognition that healing could not occur in a place so thoroughly marked by tragedy and mystery. The response of authorities to the Harrow's End disaster reveals much about how institutions handle events that challenge official narratives and conventional understanding. The federal investigation's conclusion that the deaths resulted from natural causes and hallucinations can be seen as an attempt to contain the incident within acceptable boundaries, to provide an explanation that did not require acknowledgement of phenomena that science could not explain. This pattern of official denial or minimization in the face of anomalous events is not unique to Harrow's End, but appears repeatedly throughout history whenever authorities are confronted with incidents that threaten the established order of knowledge. The subsequent military interest in the site and the ongoing restrictions on access suggest that at some level, government agencies took the anomalous aspects of the incident seriously, even if public statements maintained the fiction of a conventional mining accident. The legacy of Harrow's End extends into contemporary discussions about the relationship between humanity and the natural world, particularly the deep earth that remains largely unexplored despite our technological advances. Modern cave exploration continues to discover new systems and chambers, some of enormous size, that had remained hidden for all of human history, and occasionally these explorations encounter features that challenge our understanding of geology and natural processes. While no modern incident has matched the scale or strangeness of what occurred in the Ozark caves in 1891, there are periodic reports from spelunkers and miners of encounters with unexplained phenomena, of sounds and sights that do not fit conventional explanations, of psychological effects that seem disproportionate to the physical dangers involved. These reports are typically dismissed or ignored by mainstream science, but they persist in the oral traditions of those who work and explore underground, suggesting that whatever the miners encountered in 1891 may not have been unique, but rather an extreme example of something that remains present in the deep places of the earth. The story of the 40 miners who entered the Ozark caves in October of 1891 has been told and retold over the decades, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation and meaning while the core facts remain stubbornly mysterious. In the immediate aftermath, the story served as a warning, a reminder of the dangers of greed and the importance of respecting the boundaries between the human world and the unknown spaces beneath the earth. In later years, as the incident receded into history, it became a ghost story, a tale told around campfires to thrill and frighten listeners with its elements of horror and its unsettling lack of resolution. More recently, the Harrow's End disaster has attracted the attention of researchers interested in anomalous phenomena, who see in the incident potential evidence of realities that mainstream science has yet to acknowledge or understand. What makes the Harrow's End story particularly compelling is not just the dramatic nature of the events, but the quality of the testimony that survives. Thomas Whitley's detailed account, recorded by the town marshal in the days after his emergence from the caves, provides a narrative that is both specific and consistent, describing phenomena that seem too elaborate and too strange to be simple fabrication or hallucination. The corroborating evidence from other sources, including the Cherokee warnings documented in historical records, the pattern of earlier disappearances discovered by Marcus Holloway, and the physical and psychological state of the survivors observed by multiple witnesses, all lend credibility to the core claim that something genuinely anomalous occurred in those caves. Even skeptics who reject supernatural explanations must acknowledge that the incident involved phenomena that remain inadequately explained by conventional theories. The question of what became of the 38 men who did not return from the caves remains the most haunting aspect of the story. Were they killed by natural hazards, their bodies lost in unmapped chambers, or buried by cave-ins? Were they overcome by toxic gases that caused them to wander deeper into the system until they collapsed and died in the darkness? Or did they encounter something in the depths that transformed them in ways that Thomas Whitley's broken testimony could only hint at, something that made it impossible for them to return to the surface world even if they had wanted to. The lack of bodies, the absence of any physical evidence of their fate, leaves room for speculation that ranges from the mundane to the terrifying, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself part of what makes the story so enduring. For those who visit the site today, the abandoned cemetery at Harrow's End offers a tangible connection to the tragedy, a place where the names of the lost men are carved in stone and where the weight of unanswered questions seems to hang in the air. The memorial stands as a reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that resist explanation, still places where human understanding reaches its limits and must confront the possibility that we do not know everything about the reality we inhabit. The sealed caves themselves, hidden somewhere in the forested mountains beyond the cemetery, remain as they have been for over a century, their secrets locked away behind tons of collapsed rock and official prohibitions, waiting perhaps for a time when humanity has developed the knowledge and the courage to face what lies beneath. The Harrow's End disaster also serves as a meditation on the nature of knowledge and the price of curiosity. The miners who entered the caves in 1891 were not reckless adventurers, but working men seeking to provide for their families. Yet their decision to venture into a place that had been marked as forbidden by those who came before them led to tragedy and mystery that has echoed through the decades. The story asks us to consider whether there are some boundaries that should not be crossed, some questions that should not be asked, some doors that should remain closed. It challenges the modern assumption that all knowledge is good, and that the expansion of human understanding into every corner of the world is an unqualified benefit. Perhaps there are things in the deep places of the earth that are better left undisturbed, not because they are evil or dangerous in any conventional sense, but because they represent forms of existence so fundamentally different from our own that contact between our world and theirs can only result in madness and loss. In the end, the story of the Harrow's End disaster is not just about what happened to 40 men in the Ozark caves in 1891, but about the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of mystery in an age that believes it has explained everything. It is a story that reminds us that the earth beneath our feet is not fully known, that there are still places where maps fail and where the confident assertions of science give way to uncertainty and wonder. The two survivors who emerged from those caves carried with them testimony of experiences that could not be fully articulated or understood, experiences that shattered their minds and left them unable to return to normal life. Their suffering stands as a warning and a challenge, a reminder that there are costs to exploration and discovery that cannot always be anticipated or avoided. The families who lost loved ones in the caves, the community that was destroyed by the aftermath of the tragedy, and the investigators who tried and failed to provide satisfactory answers all became part of a larger narrative about how human beings respond when confronted with the inexplicable. Some chose denial, clinging to rational explanations even when those explanations failed to account for the evidence. Others embraced the mystery, finding in the unanswered questions a kind of terrible meaning that spoke to deeper truths about the nature of reality. Still others simply walked away, recognizing that some stories have no ending that will bring comfort or closure, that some losses cannot be recovered or explained. Each response reflects a different way of coping with the fundamental uncertainty that lies at the heart of human existence, the recognition that we are small and fragile creatures in a universe that is vast and strange and indifferent to our need for understanding. The physical evidence of the Harrow's End disaster has largely disappeared, eroded by time and weather, and the deliberate efforts of those who wanted to forget or to hide what had occurred. The town is gone, its buildings collapsed and reclaimed by the forest. The caves are sealed, their entrances buried and forbidden. The documents and testimonies that recorded the incident in detail have been scattered across archives and private collections, fragments of a story that must be pieced together by those curious or obsessed enough to search for them. Yet the story itself persists, passed down through generations, adapted and embellished, but retaining at its core the essential mystery of what happened when 40 men descended into the earth and only 2 returned with their minds broken and their testimony of horrors that language could barely contain. For modern readers and listeners, the Harrow's End story offers both entertainment and provocation. As entertainment, it provides the pleasures of a well-constructed mystery, with its atmosphere of dread, its mounting tension, and its refusal to provide easy answers. As provocation, it challenges us to consider our assumptions about the world we inhabit, to question whether the confident materialism of contemporary science has truly explained all phenomena, or whether it has simply chosen to ignore or dismiss those experiences that do not fit its paradigms. The story asks us to imagine what it would mean to encounter something genuinely other, something that exists outside the categories and concepts we use to organize our understanding of reality, and to consider whether we would have the courage or the wisdom to face such an encounter without losing ourselves in the process. The memorial stone in the abandoned cemetery at Harrow's End bears the names of 38 men who entered the earth in search of silver and never returned. Those names represent not just individual tragedies, but a collective mystery that has never been solved and perhaps never will be. They stand as a reminder that there are still unknowns in the world, still places where human ambition and curiosity can lead to consequences that cannot be predicted or controlled. The story of what happened in the Ozark caves in October of 1891 remains, more than a century later, a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the limits of human understanding. It invites us to approach the unknown with both curiosity and caution, to seek knowledge while recognizing that some truths may be too strange or too terrible for human minds to safely comprehend. And it reminds us that beneath the familiar surface of the world we think we know, there may be depths that remain forever beyond our reach, spaces where the rules we take for granted no longer apply, and where the very foundations of reality shift in ways that can shatter those who venture too far into the darkness.